All right, so tonight we're diving into something pretty dark.
Yeah. Dark and mysterious and, well, a bit gruesome. The kind of thing that still gives people chills.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We're talking about Jack the Ripper. I mean, it's 1888, Whitechapel, London, you know, the fog, the gas
The
lamps.
cobblestone streets.
Yeah. And a killer, or killers, I guess we should say, stalking the night.
Right. Because, there are a lot of theories. And even after all this time, nobody really knows for sure who Jack the Ripper was.
So for this deep dive, we're going to look at the Wikipedia entry on Jack the Ripper.
It's a good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of information there, historical context, details of the crimes, the investigation.
Right, and of course the theories. All the different theories about who Jack the Ripper might have been.
And, we'll try to sift through it all, the facts, the speculation, the myths.
So we can give you, the listener, a clearer picture.
Or at least a more informed picture.
Exactly. So let's start with the setting. Whitechapel in the late 19th century. What was it like?
Grim. I mean, really grim. You have to imagine a place overflowing with people, most of them living in poverty.
Right. And not just poverty. There was violence.
Yeah.
Alcoholism, prostitution.
Yeah, all of that. And then you have an influx of Irish immigrants and Jewish refugees.
So there were already these existing tensions, social unrest.
Absolutely. I mean,
Right.
Whitechapel was known for its anti-Semitism, its racism. It was a place where violence could erupt at any moment.
So it was a powder keg, basically.
Yeah.
And then into this powder keg steps Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. And we have those 5 murders that are generally attributed to him, the canonical 5.
Right. So let's talk about those. The first victim was Mary Ann Nichols.
Found on August 31st, 1888, on Bucks Row, which is now Durward Street. Her throat was slashed. And she had these, they weren't really cuts, more like mutilations on her abdomen.
Horrific.
Yeah. And then a week later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman was found, this time on Hanbury Street.
And her injuries.
Even more brutal. Her throat was cut and she was eviscerated. The killer, whoever he was, removed her uterus.
And there was a witness in this case, right?
Yeah. Someone said they saw Chapman with a man earlier that night, described him as having dark hair and looking like a down-on-his-luck gentleman.
Vague, but still, it's something.
Right. But then the next 2 murders happened on the same night, September 30th.
A double event. The first victim that night was Elizabeth Stride.
Found in Dutfield's yard, which is Henrique Street now. This one's interesting because the only injury was a single cut to her carotid artery.
No abdominal mutilations.
No. Which has led some people to believe that the killer was interrupted.
And the witness accounts for this one.
Conflicting. Some said the man with her was blonde, others said he had dark hair, some said he was dressed in rags, others said he was wearing something else entirely.
So it's hard to know what to make of that.
Exactly. And then it's just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was found, this time in Mitre Square.
And her injuries.
Similar to Chapman, throat cut, extensive abdominal incision, evisceration. This time the killer took her left kidney and most of her uterus.
And her face was mutilated.
Right. And in this case, there was a witness named Joseph Lewend who said he saw Eddowes with a fair-haired man who was shabbily dressed. But, his friends who were with him couldn't corroborate his story.
So again, it's difficult to say for sure. But there's another interesting detail in this case, right?
Yeah. Eddowes' bloody apron was found on Goldston Street with some graffiti above it. It was anti-Semitic.
And the police commissioner, Charles Warren, had it removed before sunrise.
Right. He was worried it would cause riots. Remember, there was already a lot of anti-Semitism in Whitechapel.
Makes you wonder if the killer was trying to, to pin the blame on someone else. Or maybe he was just trying to stir up trouble.
It's possible. And then the final victim of the canonical 5, Mary Jane Kelly.
Found in her room on Miller's Court on November 9th.
And this one was the most horrific of all.
Her throat was cut down to the spine.
Her face was completely mutilated. You couldn't even recognize her. And all of her abdominal organs were gone, even her heart.
So we have these 5 murders, all incredibly brutal. But what about the modus operandi? What are the things that connect them?
Well, all the victims were women, and they were all prostitutes.
And the murders all happened at night, right?
Right. And often on weekends, towards the end of the month.
And the way the victims were killed.
Yeah. The throat cuts, the genital and abdominal mutilations, the organ removal.
And the facial disfigurement.
Right. It's like the killer was trying to erase their identities.
Mm-hmm.
And except for Stride, the mutilations got progressively worse.
So it's like with each murder, the killer was becoming more and more depraved.
Exactly. But we should also talk about the other murders in the Whitechapel file, the ones that aren't considered part of the canonical five.
Right. Like Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram.
Yeah. Smith was attacked in April of 1888, and she was brutally assaulted. But she said it was multiple attackers, so it doesn't fit the pattern.
And Tabram.
She was stabbed 39 times in August of 88, but there were no throat or abdominal cuts, so she's usually excluded, too.
And what about the others? Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie.
Hmm.
The Pigeon Street torso.
Mylett was strangled. Mackenzie had a cut to her carotid artery. And the torso, well, that's a whole other story.
Right. The Thames torso murders. Nobody ever figured out who was behind those.
Nope. And there's no conclusive evidence that they were connected to Jack the Ripper.
So we have all these murders, all this violence, and the police are trying to find the killer.
Yeah, but they weren't very successful. They investigated something like 300 suspects.
The 300 suspects, that's a lot.
Yeah. And they formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of citizens who were trying to help with the investigation.
Right. And they were focused on butchers, surgeons, doctors, people who knew how to use a knife.
Makes sense. I mean, the way the victims were mutilated.
Yeah. And then you have Queen Victoria, who thought it might be a cattle boat worker.
But that theory was dismissed pretty quickly.
Right. Because the murders didn't line up with the arrival of the cattle boats.
Exactly. But it shows just how desperate people were to find an explanation. I mean, even the Queen was trying to figure it out.
And then you have Thomas Bond. He was a police surgeon who examined the victim's wounds.
And he's considered one of the first criminal profilers. He looked at the evidence and concluded that the 5 canonical murders were committed by the same person.
And he didn't think the killer was the surgeon, right?
Yeah. He said the mutilations were too crude, too messy. He thought it was a solitary man who was driven by some kind of homicidal or erotic mania.
And there was no evidence of sexual assault.
Right. But Bond thought that the mutilations themselves could have been sexually motivated.
So we have this profile, this glimpse into the mind of the killer, and then they're all the suspects.
Oh, yeah. Over 100 suspects have been proposed over the years.
Like Montague Druitt, Severin Klosowski, Heron Kosminski, Francis Tumblety.
Right, but the evidence against them is all circumstantial.
And then there's that DNA evidence that came out recently pointing to Aaron Kosminski.
Yeah, but even that's contested. Some people say the DNA sample was contaminated.
So it's still a mystery.
Yeah.
But we also have to talk about the letters.
Right, the letters that were supposedly written by Jack the Ripper.
Like the Dear Boss letter.
Yeah, that one was received on September 27th, 1888.
Yeah.
And it was the first one to use the name Jack the Ripper.
And it threatened to clip a lady's ears.
Right. Which, in a way, did happen with Catherine Eddowes, but most people think that letter was a hoax, probably written by a journalist.
And then there's the Saucy Jackie postcard.
That one was sent on October 1st, and it claimed responsibility for the double event, the murders of Stride and Eddowes.
But it was postmarked after the murders were made public.
Right, so whoever wrote it probably just read about it in the newspapers.
And then there's the From Hell letter.
That one was sent to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It was postmarked October 16th.
And it came with a piece of a human kidney.
Right, and the writer claimed to have eaten the other half. It was pretty gruesome.
But they never figured out if the kidney actually came from one of the victims.
Nope, and a lot of experts think it was just a hoax.
So we have all these letters, all this speculation, and then you have the media frenzy.
Oh, yeah. The newspapers had a field day with this story. It was all over the front pages.
I mean, it was a huge story.
Huge. And at first there was a lot of misinformation. Rumors were flying around.
And they were calling the killer Leather Apron at first.
Right. John Pizer, a local shoemaker, but he was cleared pretty quickly.
And then the Dear Boss letter came out, and everyone started calling him Jack the Ripper.
And that name just stuck.
It became a legend.
Yeah. And it really changed the way people thought about serial killers.
So Jack the Ripper, this shadowy figure, had a lasting impact.
He did. I mean, the crimes themselves led to some changes in Whitechapel. They started clearing out the slums.
Trying to improve living conditions?
Right. But the legend of Jack the Ripper lives on. Some of the places associated with the murders are still there.
Like the 10 Bells pub.
Yeah. That's supposed to be where some of the victims drank. And there's even a Jack the Ripper museum.
So people are still fascinated by this case.
Oh, yeah. And the way he's been portrayed in popular culture, it's changed over time.
He went from being this phantom, this monster in the shadows, to being almost a symbol of class conflict.
And then he became this horror movie villain.
Right. There have been so many books, movies, TV shows about Jack the Ripper.
It's like he's become this archetype of evil.
So here we are, over a century later, and we're still talking about Jack the Ripper.
It's because the mystery remains. We still don't know who he was.
And the brutality of the crimes, it's just so chilling. It really makes you think about the dark side of human nature.
It does. And it makes you wonder what kind of person could do something like that.
And that's what we want you, the listener, to think about. Why are we still so fascinated by Jack the Ripper?
What does this enduring fascination tell us about ourselves?
About our fear of the unknown, our need to understand evil.
It's a question worth pondering.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark heart of Victorian London.
And remember, the fog may have cleared, but the mystery of Jack the Ripper remains.
Until next time.